Hey guys, if anyone's here, let me know if you can see me, if you wouldn't mind just typing in the chat. I don't want to go on for half an hour before anyone can hear me. Mind just typing in the chat. I don't want to go on. Okay, thank you, Susanna. Nice. Okay, that's not what I want. Okay, so we're gonna talk about After Effects, right? And we're gonna talk a little bit about some animation. Let me reset this workspace. Okay, nice. So this is After Effects, and as you know, basically what I want to look at is how you can parent and animate, right? So I'm gonna make a new comp here. That's fine. And then I'm going to make a couple of layers, right? So I'm going to first make a shape layer and stick a circle on it, because that'll be the easiest way to do this. Ellipse, why that was so difficult, I'm not sure. And then I will take a color and fill it. And so maybe if we're just kind of keeping in line with the idea of that eye, we can do that, right? And so then what I'm going to call here is I'm going to call this white. What is, there's a word for that, white of eye, yeah, or just like the main eye, right? And then eyeball, there we go, that's actually perfect. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another shape layer, actually just hit Command D on this guy and call this pupil, right? Got it. So now what we've got, right, are two shapes, and I'm going to take the second one and I'm going to make it like that dark color. And again, I typically avoid using anything that's totally black, because pure blackness is not something that exists in nature. And so and oftentimes too, you end up layering stuff in blending modes, and you're going to crush everything. You know, when you have a lot of darks on top of each other, they're just going to get darker. And so starting a little bit away from the bottom, and same thing too when you're going with super bright, is not just like slamming this to the bottom right every time, but giving yourself a little bit of wiggle room later, and you can always change it after. I've found has been a good saver for me. And so what I'm going to do, right, is I'm going to turn off frame edges, and I have this pupil, right? And so presently, probably what people were experiencing is, right, if I come to this pupil and I try and move this, or excuse me, the eyeball, and try and move it, the pupil doesn't come with it. Right, and actually what I'm also going to do is I'm going to off-center this just a little bit, right, so that it kind of has that situation. And parenting is pretty much what it sounds like. You can essentially take this parent right here and just click it to another layer. And what I will call out here that's really important is this parent that says in this parent column is different to this pick whip, even though it looks exactly the same, right? So oftentimes you'll have these properties up, and you'll have this pick whip, and you'll be trying to pick whip stuff to one another, and you're like, this isn't happening, right? This pick whip down here is a way to link properties. If I only want to link this position to this position, I can use this pick whip, right? And that'll give me, now they'll move exactly together, but as you can see, I lost my offset because they're going to be in exactly the same position, right? Whereas the difference between that and this one is you'll see that when I parent this, actually nothing changes, right? But immediately then, I'm going to clear that, immediately then when I start to move them, they'll move together, right? Which is pretty much what we want, right? So maybe to do an animation, you know, we might want, let's say we just start our eye here, and then we move forward in time a little bit, and we move it to like there, right? So this is a very basic animation in After Effects, and the first thing, I'm going to play this, and the first thing you're going to notice is this looks like garbage, right? It doesn't, it's like a little bit choppy, it's not very exciting, it just kind of moves from left to right and doesn't do anything interesting. And so this is our starting point for keyframes, and what's important to notice here is the shape of this keyframe, right? As you can see down here is a little diamond, right? Which basically means that it's what's called a linear keyframe, right? And a linear keyframe is only going to just basically take you from one point to the other, right? Like I get from if I'm looking down here, I have to get from 457 to 1351 in, you know, this is, if I make it 2 seconds and we're at 24 frames, I have 48 frames to do that. What's the difference divided by 48? I'm going to move exactly that amount each time. Which is fine. Like, there, I mean, that's useful sometimes, right? But this is not exactly interesting, and it's not exactly natural or organic, right? And so I'm going to talk, just to, again, really trying to cover the bases here. I'm going to talk about easing now, right? And easing is a way to essentially tell the object how to get from this position to this position, right? And so rather than going an even amount every frame, maybe I want you to start slow, speed up, and then kind of slow down again. And the way that you do that in After Effects, right, is with this graph editor. So if you select the property that you want, that you're animating, like position, and then you click the graph editor, you now get these lines that are here, right? And this, I remember the first time I saw this, I was just like terrified. I was like, what do you mean I have to do math? Like, I don't get it at all. And this can be pretty intimidating because, like, I can click things and I can kind of move them, but what am I doing, right? And so the first thing that I want to call out is that if you see this graph, this is the more advanced value graph. If you see a graph that has red and yellow, or red and green lines like this, what you should do is come down here to this icon that says choose graph type and options and change that over to the speed graph, right? This is probably the graph that, if you guys have used After Effects, you're more used to seeing. Couple things to note there. First of all, there's 2 lines here, right? Whereas there's only 1 here. And that's because this is just changing the speed of your entire animation, not changing the values of the individual. Sort of hard to see the graph. Okay, cool. Sorry, is that a little bit better? So yeah, I'm not sure if there's a way that I can zoom in. But so yeah, so what we're looking at here is we have 2 graphs, right? And what you'll notice is that one is essentially changing values, right? It goes from negative 457 to positive 1351. This is the x aspect of this, right? On a position, I have both x and y. And so this is each axis. It's the value of each dimension, whereas the speed graph is kind of a composite of the whole thing, right? And so what you want to do, literally the most helpful shortcut in After Effects that I can show you guys is F9, right? And what that does is when you come here, and how you get to it otherwise is Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease, right? And you can see if I just hit F9, first of all, that keyframe icon, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit small, it becomes kind of like an hourglass, right? And so you can tell that it's eased that way. And I'm going to hit Command Z to go back. But if I come to the graph and I click on position to see the curve, you can see presently it's totally flat, right? It's moving at a linear pace, right? This is how fast it's moving. And you can see here the position of the eyeball is moving 447 pixels per second at the entire span of the animation, right? It's going at a constant linear speed. But if I select this keyframe, and you'll see here that it's blue for being selected in this environment, and then over here I get this yellow Bezier handle with the filled in yellow, right? This one's not filled in, whereas this one is. And so what I can do is if I hit F9, what you're going to see happen inherently is that I'm going to get this effect where my ball starts moving at like 2 pixels a second, right? It's probably pretty small to see, but at like 2 pixels a second down there. And then by the time you get up to here, it's moving really fast. It's moving 600 pixels a second. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select that keyframe and hit F9. And so now what I've done is I've created an ease out where it's easing out of its first keyframe at a very slow pace, speeding up, speeding up, speeding up, speeding up, speeding up, and then slowing down, slowing down, slowing down, slowing down again. And so if I come here now and I watch what this does, do you see it, right? Do you see how that's different? And what I'm going to do for the sake of this is I'm going to duplicate these guys, move them up, and then I'm just going to do this essentially, right? Except, so here's another good thing, right? Here I have a situation where I have this object and I want to move it, right? So I hit P on this eyeball, and I come up here and I move it, but what you'll see happens is it adds this other keyframe here, which I don't want. Fortunately, there is a way to do this, and all you have to do is go to one of the keyframes and then select all of your keyframes and then change the Y, right? So now it'll have changed across the board, so I can do that. And so what I'm going to do here is, you can see this bottom one is going to be eased, and then I'm going to take the ease off of these keyframes. And how you do that is by holding down Control or Command and clicking on the keyframes, right? And so what you'll see is I go to this graph, the bottom one looks like this, and then I'll hold Control and click on this one to show it. You can see the difference here. This one's going to get faster and then go slower, whereas the one on top is going to go linearly. And so as I play this animation, you can kind of exactly see how that happens, right? It's starting slower, right? So at this point, like halfway through the animation, it's a little bit behind because it started slower. But then towards the end of the animation, it speeds up and gets ahead of it. But then you'll notice that they both hit at exactly the same time because that keyframe is still at the same position, right? So you can do this to easy ease, just inherently smooths out your motion. It just feels more natural. But don't stop there, right? If you go back to this graph editor, these things have Bezier handles, right? So you can use them to modify this curve even further, right? And so excuse me, an animation style that is very common is the heavy ease in, right? Which basically means you want something to zip in but then slow down very gradually, right? It's a really good way to bring things on screen. And so the way that you do that, right, is you want things to zip in, you want them to start very fast, right? That's the goal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this handle back, because if you remember, this is time, and this is speed, right? So I want at the low time, at the low frame counts, I want the value of this graph to be high. So I'll pull this graph back and look at that. Now I'm getting a zoom, and if I just play this, as we can see, oh, I'm sorry. My bad. So yeah, so basically when we go back to the easy ease by pressing F9, this is our time axis here, right? As I move this way from left to right, I progress in time, and as I move vertically from bottom to top, you progress in speed, right? It gets faster as it goes higher. And so I'll select this keyframe, and now that I've easy eased it, I have this Bezier handle to play with, and I can crank this back to do that, right? And then when I play this, what you'll see is what we expect to happen, right? In that this starts really fast, right? So it picks up and it goes further than our linear guy, but then eventually the linear guy starts to catch up, right? And so we can drasticize this even further by taking this one and really pulling it out. And so this is a very common curve that we see, kind of is like the exponential decay essentially. And what you'll see, the effect that you get, is you can see that it really zips out, it really zips over, right? And so if this was an example, like it moves like literally, you can see it's moving 7,000 pixels almost at the first frame, right? Or at the first frame, excuse me, it's moving 2,000 pixels, right? It's moving really, really fast, right? And that's obviously per second, not per frame. But it comes in just like, comes in hot, right? It just flies in. And so a situation where this might be useful is when you're animating things on screen, right? So if I do that same trick that I was doing to move the other one up, where I come to the beginning, I select, if you click on the property name, it selects all the keyframes. So I'm just going to do that for both, and then I'm going to slide these off screen so that they start off screen, right? And then if you play it, you can kind of see the difference between these animations, right? And you can tell which one is more interesting. Like, let's solo them, right? You can turn these layers off. Like, that feels organic and interesting, right? Whereas this is like, I am a robot and I am walking onto a screen, right? Like, there's nothing moves that way. You can't start moving without, you know, speeding up essentially, right? So so that's how that works. And so what we can do too is that any property that you can keyframe, you can also graph edit, right? And so something else where the parenting comes into play here is that the other thing that I can do with my parent layer, right, is if I bring my frame edges back, I can rotate this, right? And as I rotate this, you can see that because my pupil is right in the middle of this circle, or excuse me, because this pupil is parented to this circle, it spins where when the eyeball spins, right? But here's the important part: is we're talking about anchor points, right? And so if we click on this pupil, we can see that the pupil has its anchor point in the center of the pupil, right? And then if I go to rotate this pupil, it's going to spin about that center, right? It's going to spin around the pupil. Whereas once I've parented this, as I have, you can see here that the anchor point for my large white circle, right, if I solo this, my large white circle is in the center of the white circle, right? And so then when I rotate this, right, the white circle, right, doesn't move because it's just rotating around the center of itself, whereas this black circle actually rotates as if its axis center was the center of this parent, right? So boom. So that way I can get a spinning eye. And so what I might do, right, here's a situation is where you can use layering, right? So if I want to maybe, let's say, start this animation at 0, so I'll set a key for that, and then I'll come over to my 2 second, and maybe I'll say I want it to have rolled, what do we think that is? 2.5 times? Right? And so what you'll notice now is that when I play this, I get this rolling eyeball, but it looks ridiculous, right? Because it's a linear set of rolls, even though my motion, my movement, my position keyframes are heavily eased, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here, I'm going to hit F9, come here, hit F9, come into the graph editor and mimic that same kind of really heavy ease in exponential decay thing that I did before. And now what you'll see is it rolls a lot, but then it slows down towards the end, right? Cool. And this is like some weird, you know what should, okay, here's another thing. I want to make a weird smiley face with these weird things that I've just created, right? And so that's a situation that I come across a lot, where I've kind of built this thing, but then I need to move the whole thing, right? I need to kind of take all of these layers and all of their keyframes and all of their whatever and just kind of just move it entirely, right? And so parenting is also how we can solve this issue, right? So what I'm going to call this is pupil eased, eyeball eased, and then these ones are going to be called eyeball linear and pupil linear, just so I can keep my mind straight. So here's how we do this, right? The first thing we're going to do is, you may have used these null objects before, right here, and you may have gotten them from places or not totally understand what they're for. This is 100% what they are for. If I make a null object, it's just a layer. It's just the thing that sits in the middle of my comp that doesn't do anything. It doesn't add any image data. If I put an effect on it, it won't show, but it still has transform properties. So what I can do, right, is I want to keep my eyeball or my pupils parented to those eyeballs. But what I might want to do now is take both of these eyeballs and parent them to this null, right? And then what I can do is I can call this null pivot, and if I change the rotation of this null, you'll see that the entire scene changes, right? And that's what's important to remember about that is that it's changing from where this anchor point is in the middle, right? And so you've got, now I've just moved my entire animation to being a vertical animation instead, right? So I've just taken that whole thing and I've transformed it, and all my keyframes stay. They're now just like, basically, they look at this parent to be pivoted first. And so there's other things I can do with that too, right? I can move them, right, like this. I can kind of take both of them and move them. I can do that. I can scale them, same thing, right? All kinds of stuff like that, right? Any of these kind of these parent transforms I can do to my eyeballs. And then here's the coolest part. Here's the coolest part. So say that I've okay, so I pivoted this the way that I want it, and I'm going to just get this into the right position for me. So I want these to land essentially at the middle of the frame. So I'm going to turn on my guide by hitting comma, or excuse me, apostrophe, and I'm going to move these eyeballs using my parent now down to the center, right? Got it. And now watch this. Watch this. I can now delete that null, and all of those transforms stay on my having trouble. Okay. Is it my face is in the way? My face is probably in the way. Oh, why is it doing that? Just a moment. I'm sorry about that. Make my window a little smaller, see if that fixes it. I will also turn my face off. Sorry about that. This is important. I want to make sure that we all get it. So I'm gonna, excuse me for backtracking a little bit, but I'm gonna just come over here and hit Command Z a couple of times, right? So here where we were, right? We have this sideways animation where this stuff kind of just rolls in like that, right? And so basically I want to now pivot this entire thing, right? And so I'll move this right down. I want to pivot this whole thing. I'm paranoid about you guys not being able to see me. This is a little bit better. Let's go in. Okay, so I want to pivot this whole thing. So I've made this new null, and I've parented my two eyeballs to it, right? And so now I'm going to come to that pivot, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, right? And what you're gonna see is that these two eyes rotated about the center of this null, right? This null is in the center, so it's like the entire composition rotated from the center. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to position these eyes, scroll down, move them over so it's kind of in the middle about there. And now what I can do, that I have this animation, right, where this is cool, they're kind of falling into the middle like that, and you can see my two different and what I might actually do is I might speed it up just a little bit. It's a little slow at the moment. So I'm going to take these guys and just move them to be in the middle. Right? So now I have these two balls. And this even makes it, as I've sped them up, makes it a lot more apparent how much better that ease looks, right? And so what I'm also going to do, just for the sake of it, is I'm going to copy those keyframes, put them on the linear pupil. I'm going to hit R to reveal my rotation property, and then I'm going to Control-click them to remove the ease. Right, and then something that might be fun is just to have this one spin the other way, right? So if we do -2 and 180. So now one's going to spin that way, and that one's going to spin the other way. Except, what did I do? Oh, I put the rotation on the pupil. See, this is the problem, right? So obviously, the pupil is spinning, but it's not you can't see it spin, right? Because it's just spinning around its center. So I can now essentially just go to the ears, keyframes, hit Command X to copy them, go to my eyeball this time, and paste them so that I get these weird spinning eyeballs. I don't know what is going on there. That's weird. Right? And that's just the difference, as you can see, by easing these keyframes, I've inherently taken the two things that are moving exactly the same way. They're moving the same rotation and the same position. Yeah, I'll talk about the graph for sure. So they're moving the same way, but you can see the drastic difference between the way that they animate, right? The keyframes are, again, if I hit U to reveal all my keyframes, the keyframes are at the exact same point, but look how differently they move, right? And then, so the other thing that I want to show you guys is that I have this motion, right, that's happening, but presently they're just moving in a straight line, right? Which is probably what I want. I probably want them to just fall in straight from the top. But something that I want to show you while we look at it too is that look at this. I have a little, you can probably not even see this. I have a little Bezier handle here, and what you'll notice too is that here I don't, right? And what's the difference between that is that I've eased this keyframe and I have not eased this one, right? So when you've eased the keyframe, you get these handles that if you come up here and click on your pen tool, you can now just add points to this path, right? You can come in here and you can see now that I've added a point to that, my thing not just rolls, but it now follows this kind of squiggle. And you might have done that in the past by setting a bunch of keyframes, and it did set a keyframe if you see, but look, it doesn't affect the speed of it at all, right? When I added that keyframe, it maintained the constant speed that I had before. It didn't jerk, as opposed to, let's look at it how I would do it the other way, right? Is if I would come here and maybe be like, okay, well, I want to move this guy not on the wire. That's actually a really good thing to call out. I will in a second, but I want to move this thing over here or whatever. You can see that our graph is going to have a big old kink in it, right? What's going to happen is you can see that it kind of sticks there for a second when this velocity change happens. And so you can use these Bezier tools here, and the shortcut for the pen tool in After Effects is G, by the way, not P. For P will reveal position. But then I can kind of take these points and I can convert them so that maybe this is doing some silly stuff, right? And I'll pull this one the same way, like that, right? And so now I have this kind of groovy squiggly animation that we can look at, right? And they kind of land and come in together like that. Maybe a bit extreme. Yeah. And so, okay, so two things really quick. The first thing that I want to call out is that notice that this eyeball, right, presently, I want to move it, let's say, to the left, right? So what I might do is I might come down to position and I might move the X, and you're like, what the heck? Why is it moving up? And you have to realize that A, it's still parented, and B, it's rotated, right? So even if I delete this null, what you'll notice is, can you see this? There's a 180 down here, right? 2 and 180, 2.5. And if I delete this pivot, which has a rotation of 90, what's going to happen is that 180 goes to 270, right? That rotation now becomes applied to this object, right? And so now if I was to move this, it becomes the correct movement because it's no longer parented, right? So Y is still Y and X is still X. And so you can use this technique of parenting stuff, moving it the way that you want it, and then killing the parent and just deleting it to like really transform whole animations. Again, it's this easy, right? Command Shift Option Y to make a null, grab my two eyeballs, move them over here, hit R, spin it this way, move it over here. What did I just do? Move it over here, right? And now delete that null. And inherently, I've just transformed my entire animation to be over here, right? And this will also work with scale and all sorts of other things. So that is parenting and how you can use it to make this stuff happen. So I want to go back to the graph just to give that other quick overview really quick while hopefully we can see the screen properly this time. Let me give myself a little more room. My fault about that. And so the first thing is when you set a keyframe by default, they're going to look like this, right? These diamonds that are here that are going to give you linear keyframes. And again, this is my, sorry for getting kind of small, this is my right eyeball here, right? Where it just moves totally in a very static fashion, right? And if I go to the graph edit for that, you can see that the velocity is constant, right? The speed of it is it's always moving at 894 pixels per second, right? Whereas what I can do with easing, so if I come down to these guys, and what I'm just going to ease it from scratch, right? So I'll select my keyframes, and I will hit F9. Why did that not work? Oh, I didn't have them selected. F9, right? And that's going to give me my graph back, right? Is this F9? We'll do it. It's going to give me my graph back. And what you'll notice here too is I'm actually easing both the position and the rotation at the same time, which is really nice, so that I can make sure that they're syncopated, right? So that it rotates as fast as it moves, right? So I've selected both of those guys. And so let's think about what kind of motion we want this to have, right? We want this to have a very fast motion to start and then to slow down as it comes to a stop, right? So at the beginning of my timeline, at time 0, right, I want this graph to be high. I want this to be moving really quickly. And so I'll just take this and pinch it back that way. And then basically the same thing too is I want it to slow down rather quickly and then kind of ease into its final position. And so I'll pull that over that way. If I move my playhead, you'll see that I'm basically starting ridiculously fast, but very quickly slowing down, right? And so then as I animate this, as I play this back, you'll see that that easing is totally different. You know, for instance, what you could do, so now I'm back on my linear keyframes up here, right? I'm gonna select these and I'm gonna hit F9 to ease. I don't know why it keeps deselecting them. I'm gonna hit F9 to ease them, right? And you'll see that these curves look different than these curves because my rotation is going negative, right? So that makes total sense. It goes down, it goes below 0, right? But maybe I wanna do the opposite here, where I want this to start really slowly, but then kind of like zip into place, right? And so what I can do to start with is just mimic that exactly. So now if I play this, you can see what happens, right? Is this first one kind of slowly comes into place where the last one takes its time. And this is a situation where you might want to actually not go so extreme, right? You might want it to have a little bit of a slowdown, even though it's still supposed to be this like kind of fast entry. Nothing can just abruptly come to a stop unless it hits a wall or something like that, right? So what I'll do is I'll come into this keyframe, right? And something that irritates me a lot is that After Effects tries to be helpful by giving you these like bounding box controls. I don't know if you can see them, but just turn them off. Click this thing down here, this little bounding box thing, so that you can just actually click your keyframes correctly. And so then what I'm going to do, right, is I'm just going to add a little bit of a slowdown, right? So, and my graph should reposition itself, yeah. And so what I still want to happen, right, is I still want to zip into place, but then I want it to have a frame or two. I'm going to take this back out. I want it to have a couple of frames to slow down before it totally lands into place. And so maybe we'll do something like that, right? So I hit a really high speed, but then I slow back down. And so if I come back to my preview and I play it, you can see now that this one on the right still zips in, but it doesn't feel nearly as abrupt, right? So now I have kind of two opposite eases. I keep trying to tap, sorry. I have two opposite eases, right? This one is what you call an ease out because it's coming from, it's coming out of its resting place, right? Whereas this one is an ease in because you're coming into its resting place. And so those are the terms that you can use to describe those two things. And so that's really cool, right? You've just got these two eyeballs that kind of animate differently, even though you have literally the exact same values on your keyframes. So that's cool. So then the other thing that I want to show, excuse me, is that I can layer these animations, right? So say that maybe I have this thing falling, but then maybe let's try something, right? Like, why don't we have a null, right? And we will parent our eyeballs back to that null. And maybe what I want to actually do is so let's draw a smiley face, right? I think we're missing the component to make something kind of cheeky. So I'm going to draw a smiley face. Let me make sure I'm checking the select. Okay. So how I'm going to do that, right, is I'm going to come here and I'm going to make a new shape layer. I'm going to open up that shape layer, scroll out a little bit. I'm going to bring my frame edges back, Command Shift H. I'm going to add another ellipse, and I'm going to unlink them, move it a little bit wider so that I'm kind of making a smiley face shape. and then move it down a little bit, right? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, convert to Bezier path, hit G to get to my pen tool, and I want the pen tool, and then I'm going to delete this point, right? And then what I can do is I need to unclose this path, right? And so let's figure this. I know how to do this. I just don't exactly remember where it lives. I'm pretty sure you right click and you go to oh, there it was. Right click and you go to closed, right? So I can uncheck that and it will inherently just take that, it'll unclose that mask. There's other cool options in there too, like set first point and things like that, right? So if you need to change the direction of your spline, you can do that as well. The other thing that I want to, this is hard, man. I just got so much, let's stick on track. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stroke this, right? And I'm going to make that a bigger stroke, and I might change the caps to be round so I get those nice little round edges, right? And then I could change the color to, I guess lips are like red, right? Maybe we'll go with like a paler red. Whatever. Hide my frame edges. Now I have this smiley face, right? It's kind of a goofy smiley face. And so what I actually want to do to make this seem a little bit ridiculous is I want to put this on top. So I'm going to remember that my anchor point for this layer is in the center. If I just rotate this 180, it's just going to flip around, right? And if I do that interactively, you can see that it just rotates to the other side, right? And so now what I might want to do is set this back to 180, zoom out, right? And then what I might do is I might make a new, and we'll call this smileys, or lips, I guess, smile. Then I'll move this to the bottom just because I'm anal about weird things like that. And so what I'm going to do now is I can spin this whole thing, right? But presently those lips don't move with it. So I'm going to take my lips and parent them to my null, and I'm going to call this pivot. And so now my whole thing pivots, right? And so what I could do, for instance, is maybe I have these eyeballs come in like this, and then the whole thing can kind of flip around, right? So I can, and what I want to do actually is I want to start flipped around. So I want these eyeballs to come up from the floor. No, I'm wrong. I'm going to do it this way. This is the animation process. You just try things over and over until you get something that's kind of cool. And then I'm going to do the same thing here where I flip it back. So essentially I now have this animation of everything coming in, and then I flip around, right? And so what I actually want to do, this is actually pretty cool. We're going to do it together. We're going to do it live. Is I want these balls to come in from the bottom, right? That would make a lot more sense. And so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to come back to the smile, and I'm going to kill my rotation so that it's on the bottom, and then I'll flip the whole thing, right? So now when I do my little tween backwards, which I'm going to do here by setting a keyframe and then moving forward and going back to 0, if I play this now, they kind of float up and then my whole thing spins. But I can do better than that, right? I can ease these keyframes, come into my graph, and maybe make this a little bit more drastic. And if I just pull that handle over, you see it starts slow, but it speeds up very quickly. It doesn't come out of the gate so fast like the other thing did because it's on the screen, right? But then it still has that nice kind of graceful slowdown. Maybe I'll just pull it over a little bit. But you can see now that when I animate this, I can get it's kind of cute, right? I get this this weird animation that's happening there. And then if I wanted to be even crazier, right? I can continue layering these pivots, right? And I could, if I wanted it to then pivot from the bottom, right? Again, because if I duplicate this pivot and move it down, and then parent this pivot to pivot 2, hit R, I can now spin this around, and it'll spin around from there, right? So you can do all kinds of layered rotation animations and things like that that way. It's also just really helpful for organizing things. If you want to set a bunch of layers that you want to move in tandem with each other, you can just parent them to a null, right? And then the other cool thing, there's so many cool things, guys. The other cool thing is that even if I lock all of these layers, right, that's not lock, even if I lock all of these layers and I move my my parent, all that stuff still moves, right? So I can not even select these anymore, but I know I have this controller now to move everything with. So that's a really helpful tool as well, is just learning how to get parenting to work properly. And then so why don't we round this out by just like drawing a head on our guy. Shape layer. And then we're going to call this head. And then we're going to do the same thing where we add a, what should we do? Should we give him a star head? Why don't we give him a star head? And so we'll go to polypath. I'm going to bring my frame edges back. I'm going to change this to a polygon. And then I'm going to up the outer radius a little bit, right? So now he's got this weird head, and I'm going to spin it around so that the flat part's on top. And then I'm going to move it down a little bit so that it feels right. Okay, cool. So then now what I've got here is I've got this path that you can't see because I don't have any strokes on it, right? So what I want to do is I want to take another stroke, and maybe we'll make it like a, I don't know, like skin tone color somewhere in there. And then we'll make it a little bit larger. And then what I can do here too is I can change my joins from miter, actually I have no idea how to say that, mitter, to round. And what that's going to do is you can see if I hide my frame edges here is it's just going to kink those corners a little bit, right? So if I'm back here, they're sharp, make them round, they do that sort of thing, which is cool. So if I want to maybe make this a little bit smaller. And okay, so now the other thing, if you guys haven't seen it, this is awesome. One of these great things is called trim paths, right? When we talked about the repeater last time, the next one is trim paths. And what trim paths does is literally just animates that path, right? So I can just basically make this whole thing draw on with an animation, right? And so something that I want to do is I want to come back to this stroke, and I want to change my butt caps to round caps so that I get those you know, nicer edges or whatever. And then the other thing that I might do, just for the sake of being picky, is I might take this outer roundness and just up it a little bit to seem a little bit more cheerful, right? Just a little friendlier. And so now, okay, so now what do I want to do? First of all, I want to parent this to my pivot so that it spins, right? So now I've got this or whatever, and what I want to happen is I want this to draw on, right, as the animation for the rotation is happening, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a keyframe down here for my trim pass, or I'll close this stuff up so you can see it. I have my start, my trim pass, then my stroke, and I want at this point the stroke to be totally off, right? So I'll set a keyframe there, and then I'm going to go to where my spin stops, which is, I believe, at 2. If I hit R for rotation, yeah, at 2 seconds, and then what I can do is I can up this, right? And then so when I play this, I get this kind of thing happening. And what I've noticed here is that, no, that's actually kind of nice. I was just thinking maybe I wanted it to rotate the other way, or to draw on the other way, but I kind of like it that way. But what I'm going to do, too, like with so many other things, is ease F9, and come to this graph, and I kind of, again, want to mimic the curve that I have here, right? So I'll hit Control so that I can see them both at the same time, and then I'll try, and I know this one was pulled all the way out, and then I'll try and just kind of visually match them so that I know the peak of this one is there, so they'll both be moving at about the same speed. And then so if I play this now, right, look at that. That's kind of cool, right? So this is a way where you can use parenting and stuff to create really complicated animations by only animating one thing at a time, right? Remember, we started with these eyes coming in from the left, right? Like, we weren't even close to where we landed. But because you built it that way, and you're separating levels of control, right? You're separating control so that I can change the way that the eye drops down without having to worry about how it's rotating later, because it's rotating on a totally different layer. Those keyframes are on a totally different thing. They don't affect it. And so if you guys aren't using nulls presently, like a lot of people say you shouldn't ever even keyframe an object, right, or a layer. You should always parent it to a null and then keyframe that null. I think that's maybe a little bit extreme, but you see the point, right? You see the point is that like by having this, like, it's essentially a group in a lot of ways, like a group in Photoshop where I can transform a bunch of layers at the same time is super, super, to me, valuable, right? So hopefully it's 10:30. I'm going to keep going just because I want to kind of talk about stuff. If everyone is tired, I know it's a little bit late, feel free to hop off, but I just want to talk through a couple more things. Because I know that there was a bunch of stuff that I didn't get to. But otherwise, if you don't want to stick around, this video will be up tomorrow, so you can feel free to check it out then. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is, let's talk about matting, right? And matting is a really important concept in After Effects. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this face animation, right? And then I'm going to drop this into a new comp so that, and we'll call this like face mask or whatever. And so now I have this, basically I've pre-comped it, right? I've got this animation that's happening down there. And so now I want to get this to go away, right? I want to get this to go away. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click this square to just get a shape layer that's the full size of my comp. Again, I would discourage people from hitting Command Y for solid if you can avoid it. So double click this guy up there. And then what I want to do is I want to come and apply an effect to it. So effects are very much like filters inside of Photoshop. They're a way for me to kind of manipulate the data of that layer. And so if some people were asking, a lot of things that can be solved by effects, right? Like you can change color this way by just using, for instance, like a simple fill effect, right? You can use curves like you do in Photoshop, all the rest. But what I want to do is radial wipe. And what radial wipe does is it just essentially is I have this transition completion, like it just unwipes the screen, right? And so basically when I want to do this is I want to essentially wipe off my animation, right? I want to just take everything off the screen, and I wanted that to animate counterclockwise. And what does both do? I wonder what oh, that's kind of cool. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that, right? So what I want to do essentially is I want to basically I want to make a matte, right? I want to make a matte layer that I can use to kind of control where my face layer is visible, right? And so the easiest way to do this in After Effects is actually very, very easy, right? And so what we're going to do is you just click this track matte button down here, and you can choose either alpha or luma matte, right? Alpha means I want to look at my matte's transparency, like where it's transparent, and luma means I want to look at the white and black values. So if you've used Photoshop masks, those are luma mattes, right? You're saying don't show me where the black is and show me where the white is. Whereas alpha matte is the same thing, show me where there's stuff and don't show me where there's transparency, right? So what I'm going to do in this case is hit the alpha matte, and presently what you'll see is a couple things happen. This layer gets turned off, right? This layer, they both get these like icons demonstrating that it's matted, and this layer I can no longer see, right? But this has changed to alpha matte. And then what you'll see is, let me turn this back on just so you can move it, or to see it, is if I move this a little bit forward, right? Presently it doesn't look like anything, but what you'll notice is that face isn't underneath, right? Like that face should be there. And if I un-alpha matte these, that face is there, right? And then you'll see I cheated myself and went ahead of it, right? But what is happening essentially is this face is only being displayed where that wipe is happening, right? So I can use this matte layer to reveal angry. I think that's cool. Yeah, you can use this to like hide the shape, right? So what I might want to do towards my end is maybe I want to wipe this off. So I'll start there with it being totally animated, and then I'll step back a second and I'll go back to 0, right? 0. And so play it, but I didn't go back to 0. So one of the greatest shortcuts in After Effects is J and K. It takes you to the next keyframe and last keyframe. So J goes back, K goes forward. You can use that just to jump in time between your keyframes. So I need to do a couple of things. I need to make sure this is 0, right? And now I'm going to play it out. It goes away, right? That can, and then even though I'm not moving, I'm just animating a transition completion property. Let me ease these things, right? I'm going to select them both, F9, come in here, and I want to get it off screen, right? So I want it to leave the screen moving very fast, and I want it to kind of scooch out of that position. So I'm going to do an exponential curve, right? So we're going to start slowly, shoom, get a lot faster, right? So as I play this out now, you'll see that, and maybe what I'll do is I don't like that it goes right to the edge like that, so I'm going to add myself half a second after so I can like sit on the result a little bit. Right, and that to me is too drastic. I need to take this and pull it in a little bit so that I get a little bit of softness so that this curve happens just a tiny bit there. Right? Bam. I'm going to be Instagram famous. I have a looping face GIF. So that's matting, and you can use this matting to do all sorts of things, right? You can, one of the coolest things you can do is if I make an adjustment layer, right, which is Control-Alt-Y or Command-Option-Y, I can come in here and I can make an adjustment layer, which is, an adjustment layer is basically a layer, it's like a Photoshop adjustment layer. It affects everything else underneath it, but it doesn't have anything on it inherently. And so what I could do here is, why don't I add a blur, right? And so what I'm going to do is we'll just use, didn't they fix one? They made one better. We can use the Gaussian blur just because it's kind of like a good all-purpose blur. And so then if I, you can see that as I crank this, right, the blurriness of this shape goes up, right? So we'll call this blur. And then what I can do, right, is I can take a new cell and call this blur matte. And then what I pretty much want to do is, like, if I just move this up here and set this again to an alpha matte, you can see that the blur only happens there. It only happens underneath the thing. And as if I take this and I was to move it, right, I have this ability to kind of create this weird filter that goes on top of it. And then, yeah, so we can do that. And as you'll see that this thing isn't animating at all because the animation is all inside my pre-comp, right? But what we might want to do is say we don't like that this edge is so hard, right? And you can see here that it's hard because this yellow edge is hard. But how do I then soften that, right? And well, the answer is very simple. You just blur it, right? Like if I take this and I blur that edge, right? So my yellow is blurred, then I turn this off, you can see, hopefully, that you get a fade, right? I'm super blurred there, and I become less and less and less blurred as I go down. And so you can use that to control all kinds of stuff. And this doesn't have to be a blur. It could be like a turbulent displace, right? And so I end up, you can see here where the morph isn't quite coming through perfectly, but now I have this weird thing where I have turbulent displays happening on the top half of my shape, and if I, just for the jokes, if I bring it down, it looks a little goofy. Now it looks like poop. But yeah, turbulent displace is great because it just kind of makes everything wobbly, right? And something you can do on that turbulent displace as well is, I went into the face again. Or no, I didn't, sorry. I called this blur, that's confusing. Is that you can change its evolution so that it goes blah, 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 right? So if I set a keyframe here and then I come forward and I go blah, blah, blah. That's the technical term. I can now play this, and you'll see that I get this kind of amorphous shifting face thing that's happening, which is cool. Nice. Okay, what do I have on my list? Parenting and wiggle. I got actually through a lot of these, right? I think we're gonna leave the 3D stuff for next time, which is gonna be the lighting and the parallax and stuff, because that's just kind of a bigger topic. But I do want to talk just as a last minute about the wiggling, right? Because wiggling, I think we looked at it a little bit last week, is such a valuable tool inside After Effects to create all kinds of basic stuff, right? So what I want to do, make a new comp. I'm going to make a thing, and I'm gonna change the fill color to like a skyish blue, right? Something around there. And then what I'm gonna do too is I'm gonna add this turbulent noise, right? And what that's gonna do is it's clouds in Photoshop, right? But you have a lot more control. So I can come into the transforms of this and I can play with the scale. There's all kinds of options, look in here. But basically what I wanna do is I just wanna overlay this, and then take the opacity down. It just gives me a little variation, right? Like this is what we're talking about with texture. We just want to, and I want to drop the contrast. I just want to add a little bit of imperfection to this image so that it's not so stark baby robin egg blue or whatever. So I've got that, and then let's say that maybe I want to make a cloud, right? So I'm going to make a new shape layer, and I'm going to make an ellipse, and I'm going to make a fill, and I'm going to change this to white. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially duplicate this shape path, and I'm just kind of going to move it around to kind of make a bit of a cloud-esque shape. So make it a little bigger. Right, got something like that going on. And then I think we just need like one more, right? So I'll bring the roll out this way. Right, that's kind of like a cloud. That'll work. And then what I want to is I want to center this up, right? We can kind of see that it's off center. So how do I do that with the shape layer? If we all remember, we group them, right? And then we use this group to be able to move the object as a whole, right? And so we talked about in here the wiggle transform dude, but we can actually, what's really nice about After Effects is we can literally wiggle anything, right? And I don't want to open the can of worms right now, but I just want to talk about the wiggle. There's something up here called the wiggler, right? If you go to window and then down to wiggler, and I'll dock this up here just so we can see it. And what this essentially does is I can pick a property, right? Like position. Why is it not letting me do it? It's, I guess I'm talking out of my ass on this one. I feel like that should work. I don't know why it's all grayed out. I'm not doing something correctly. But anyway, we can do it the hard way. And so what we want to do, right, in order to get things to wiggle is we are going to become programmers for a minute. And that means that we're going to write less than a line of code in order to make something wiggle, right? And so what I can do here is that I can come to this thing and I can find my position, right? And then there's two things I can do. I basically want to add a piece of code to this position. And so I can do that by right-clicking keyframe assistant. No, where is it? I never do it this way, but you can add expression, right? Animation, add expression, or you can just option click on that stopwatch and it brings up a place for me to type code. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to type it in a type layer just so that everyone can see it, and then we'll paste it into the whatever. And so all we have to type is wiggle. Why is it all caps? Okay, there we go. So we're going to type wiggle, right, just like that. Because this is basically saying do a wiggle, right? And then what we're going to do is we have to, there's two properties that go inside of it, and that is amplitude and frequency, right? And amplitude is going to be basically how much you want it to wiggle, and frequency is how many times a second. And so maybe I want, let's put this on rotation. So say maybe I want it to rotate 30 degrees, and I want it to be 2 times a second, right? So all I do is then I copy this, right? And I'm going to paste this into, not position, we're going to do rotation. Option click there, paste, and I've got my wiggle, right? And so what will happen now is I play this, is you can see this dude is, okay, and I've made a mistake, is I've flipped the input arguments, right? So this is not amplitude and then frequency, it's frequency and then amplitude, right? And so you can see that that's evident here, because this thing is shaking 30 times a second for only 2 degrees, right? So that's the wrong way. So I'm just going to come down here and reverse those numbers. And so now you'll see that I have a much more gradual thing, right? And so then if I take my cloud and I duplicate it and I move it over here, right? And maybe I scale it up. Now I have 2 clouds that are wiggling, and you can see that they're wiggling differently, right? So this is just like an easy way to just add random animation. And what I can do too that's really nice is I can do the same thing to their position, right? I can come here, option click, wiggle. I want it to happen 1 time a second. I want it to be for 200 pixels, and I actually want it to happen only half a time a second, so 0.5. And so what you'll see now is that this dude, this layer, is not only wiggling that often, and I think both of these are too strong. If you hit E twice, EE, it reveals your expressions, by the way, and so this needs to be like 10, not 30. And so they're not going as crazy, right? So now I just have like these kind of little floaty clouds, and then I'm going to copy that expression and paste it there, and then move the keyframes, or move. I don't even have any keyframes. Look at all this motion that I'm getting with no keyframes, right? So now these things are going to appear as if they're just kind of floating around the screen, doing what they do, right? Which is cool. And again, this is happening right now on just position, but you can actually wiggle literally anything. So if I make an adjustment layer like I had done previously, and then I put an effect on it, like let's say turbulent displace, why not, right? This is just gonna like make everything kind of wobbly, which is kind of cool. But maybe I want to change this amount so that this amount kind of does this, right? So it kind of gets more intense, or maybe I'll do it to size, right? So that it kind of gets more intense or less intense. Randomly, essentially, right? And so what I can do is, and these properties down here, I can option click them, and I can type wiggle, right? And I want this to wiggle once a second, and I want it, the size is set to 100 presently, so maybe let's do like 30% of that up and down, so 30. And then what you'll see now is that you can see that this wiggle amount is actually changing, and you can see this value down there as you scrub through changes, and it's going to go anywhere from, because it was set to 100, right, 100, and we set the wiggle amount to 30, it's going to go anywhere from 70 to 130. And so this is a really good way just to add additional motion on top of stuff on a property by property basis, as opposed to a entire set of shape layer things or whatever, right? And so, and just for the sake of having some fun, you can even do it on color, right? So if I come down here to my fill and then I type wiggle once a second, I think you can do it on color because it's just a value, right? And so now I'm going to get this kind of changing color that just randomly happens like that, right? So that's cool. This is a really like easy way to just animate things randomly. And if we go back here and let's go back to just our regular face, what if we could take, now that everything is kind of built together and hooked up to this pivot, I can take this pivot and put wiggle on it, right? So actually I'll show you something really cool too, is that even though I have keyframes here, I can still wiggle this rotation, right? So I'll do wiggle 0.5 degrees, right? And so now what's going to happen is throughout the course of my animation, you can see it's subtle, but I've got this kind of, let's just crank it up a little bit so that we can see it. I've got this kind of like just kind of ambient drift happening, right? And so that's a really good way to create the illusion of camera shake, right? Where it kind of looks like my camera, and if I was to like make this, let's say, faster, so it's happening like 4 times a second, but only for like 3, you can see now that, I'm not sure if you guys can see that there, but you can see that it's really kind of just like wobbling, right? And then maybe I'll copy this expression and put it on position as well, right? And so now I'm going to have this kind of like floaty, camera shake looking dude, right? And so this could be used to make your boat bob, for instance, right? So let's say maybe we take this position and make it a little bit less like subtle. Then we'll make it like 50 pixels, right? And so now I've got this kind of like general bob that's happening. Speed it up a little bit. And bam. And again, I think that like oftentimes expressions are really scary to people, and for good reason. They can become a nightmare very quickly, but there are certain ones that that everyone kind of uses because they're just the easiest way to do things, and wiggle is 100% one of those, right? So learn the wiggle syntax so that you can get things to just add additional vibration, for lack of a better word, on top of your layers and your properties, so you can make things feel a little bit more real. Even though that we have keyframes and this is animated, by adding that little bit of shake, it suddenly takes on this entirely, you know, more floaty feeling. It just is a totally different thing, and we didn't have to animate any of those keyframes. Okay, I'm just going to go down my list one more time, and I'm going to mark stuff for next time. And basically what I need to do to get to still is the parallax situation, and as well as the lighting for Sharon and Malik, since I think that you can get a lot of good lighting for both organic stuff like Sharon and more vector illustration stuff like Malik's got. So sorry I didn't get to that. That's a big topic anyway. I'm sure we'll cover it sometime in the next couple of weeks. Sorry for the tutorial being a little weird at the beginning with that screen size. Long story, I had to clean install my PC, and I haven't totally finished setting everything up back yet. But yeah, so hopefully we'll get through some more. Thank you all so much for hanging out and everything else, and thanks for coming and for all of your hard work thus far. And next week we'll be looking at those concept decks for our second and final 9-week project, and I'm excited to see it. As always, hit me up on Slack. You know, if you have questions, more granular questions about the projects we turned in today, you know, if anyone else's project inspired you to try something new, or to give something a shot and you need some help working through it, let me know as well, and I'd be happy to chat with you guys about that. But thank you for watching, and thank you for hanging out, and have a good night, and I will see everyone next week.